Dawn broke over Shadow Creek Ranch, Montana. 5 cartel vehicles kicked up dust on the approach to what they thought was just another remote farmhouse. Their leader, known only as El Cuchillo, had killed 12 CIA operatives in his career. But he didn't know he'd just surrounded the wrong ranch. Behind weather-worn curtains, Margaret Wilson's weathered hands weren't trembling from fear as she reached for her radio. For 30 years, she'd run the CIA's most successful operations in South America. Her code name was La Viuda, the widow, and cartels still whispered stories about her. As headlights cut through morning mist, 16 heavily armed figures were already moving through her cattle fields. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because I have something really special for you tomorrow. And now, back to the video. Dawn broke over Shadow Creek Ranch, Montana. 5 cartel vehicles kicked up dust on the approach to what they thought was just another remote farmhouse. Their leader, known only as El Cuchillo, had killed 12 CIA operatives in his career, but he didn't know he'd just surrounded the wrong ranch. Behind weather-worn curtains, Margaret Wilson's weathered hands weren't trembling from fear as she reached for her radio. For 30 years, she'd run the CIA's most successful operations in South America. Her code name was La Viuda, the widow, and cartels still whispered stories about her. As headlights cut through morning mist, 16 heavily armed figures were already moving through her cattle fields. This wasn't about taking another ranch. This was about how the most notorious cartel in Mexico had just walked into a trap set by the woman who'd destroyed their organization once before, back in the killing fields of Colombia. Margaret watched through her thermal scopes as the cartel members spread out in a standard assault formation, amateur hour. They moved like thugs, not professionals. Nothing like the disciplined killers she'd faced in the jungles of Colombia 30 years ago. Her radio crackled softly, a signal from her old team, already in position around the property. Just like Bogota, 82, came a whispered voice she hadn't heard in years. Jack Reynolds, her former second-in-command, now supposedly retired in Idaho. He'd driven through the night when he got her signal, though I don't remember having quite so many grey hairs back then. Margaret allowed herself a small smile as she checked her equipment. The ranch house looked like a typical Montana homestead, all weathered wood and rusty farm equipment. But appearances were deceiving. Every fence post contained sensors. Every cattle trough hid weapons caches. She'd spent 15 years preparing this ground, knowing someday the past would catch up with her. Through her scopes, she watched El Cuchillo step out of the lead vehicle. Even at a distance, she recognized the scar that gave him his nickname, the knife. She'd given him that scar herself during an operation that had decimated the cartel's leadership. Now he was in charge, and he'd finally tracked her down. La Viuda, his voice carried across the morning air. We know you're in there. The ranch, or your life. Your choice. Margaret's hands moved across her radio equipment with practiced efficiency. Frequencies that hadn't been used since the Cold War hummed to life. Across the property, hidden systems. Activated. She'd learned long ago that the best traps were the ones your enemies never saw coming. Team 2 in position, another voice whispered through her earpiece. Maria Suarez, former Colombian Special Forces, now running a bakery in Seattle. Just like you taught us, Jefa, the field is set. El Cuchillo's men were spreading out, taking positions behind farm equipment and wooden fences that wouldn't stop a BB gun, let alone real ammunition. They thought they were surrounding a helpless old woman. Instead, they were walking into a trap laid by someone who'd spent decades planning for exactly this moment. Remember Colombia, Margaret transmitted to her team. Wait for my signal. She watched through her scopes as more cartel vehicles approached in the distance. El Cuchillo was bringing in reinforcements, just as she'd predicted, just as she'd planned for. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Margaret Wilson, age 75, former CIA legend, supposed retired rancher, reached for a familiar weapon. The rifle had been with her through 3 continents, and more firefights than she cared to remember. Like her, it might be old, but it hadn't forgotten its purpose. Last chance, vieja, El Cuchillo called out. The ranch, or we burn it down with you inside. Margaret's reply was to key in a sequence on her radio that she hadn't used since Bogota. Across the property, hidden speakers crackled to life. The sound that emerged was an old Colombian folk song, the same one that had been playing when she'd given El Cuchillo his scar. Through her scope, she saw him freeze, realization dawning too late. This wasn't just another land grab for his expanding cartel empire. This was a reunion 30 years in the making, and La Viuda had spent those years preparing a very special welcome for her old enemies. The Colombian folk song echoed across Shadow Creek Ranch, its haunting melody carrying 3 decades of history. Through her thermal scope, Margaret watched El Cuchillo's men shift nervously, their confidence cracking as they realized this was no ordinary operation. In her ear, her old team continued reporting positions, voices she hadn't heard in years now falling into familiar patterns. North Ridge secured, came Carlos Ortiz's whisper. Former Colombian army sniper, now running a fishing charter in Florida. Just like you said, Yefa. They brought the heavy weapons, but they're watching the wrong angles. Margaret's mind flashed back to Bogotá, 1982. Another morning, another trap. El Cuchillo had been young then, just a rising enforcer in the cartel. She'd orchestrated an operation that had nearly destroyed their entire organization, giving him the scar that would become his trademark. Now he was back, thinking old debts could be settled with brute force. "I see you remember the song, Miguel," she called out, using his real name, the one that hadn't appeared in any file for 30 years. "Your father was listening to it when I killed him." El Cuchillo's response was immediate and violent. "Burn it!" he screamed. "Burn everything!" His men moved to comply, pulling out incendiary devices. But Margaret had spent 15 years preparing this ground. Every piece of her ranch had been carefully chosen and positioned. "They're moving exactly as you predicted," Jack reported, setting up their firing positions behind the red tractor and the hay bales. There was a smile in his old friend's voice. "Those new composite plates we installed last summer still holding up?" "Like a charm," Margaret replied, watching through her scopes as the cartel members took cover behind farm equipment that had been specifically reinforced to serve as protection for her team, not the attackers. "Maria, status on the underground network?" "All systems green," came the response. "Tunnel entrances secured. They haven't even noticed the ventilation shafts disguised as groundhog holes." Maria Suarez had helped design this defense system, applying lessons learned from 3 decades of covert operations. The ranch house itself was a masterpiece of deception. What looked like weathered wood was cutting-edge ballistic material. Every window was bulletproof, every wall reinforced. The rusty windmill that creaked in the morning breeze contained enough surveillance equipment to shame the Pentagon. "Remember, Bogotá!" El Cuchillo shouted to his men. "La Viuda always has tricks! Check everything!" But he was 15 years too late. Margaret had begun preparing this battlefield when she'd first bought the ranch, knowing someday old enemies would come calling. Through her thermal imaging, she watched his men spread out, their movements betraying their growing unease. These weren't the hardened sicarios of the old days. These were young thugs, used to intimidating civilians, not facing professional operators. "They're bringing up the technical vehicles," Jack reported. 3 mounted 50 cals, just like intel suggested. In the distance, heavy trucks appeared, through the morning mist, weapons mounted in their beds. "Want us to take them out now?" "Not yet," Margaret replied, her mind racing through scenarios she'd wargamed 1,000 times. "Let them commit fully to the field. Carlos, status on those modified fence posts?" "Ready on your signal," the former sniper responded. "Though I still can't believe you spent 3 years planting explosives in fence posts." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. 5 years, actually. Had to space it out so the satellite imagery wouldn't show patterns. She'd built this killing ground piece by piece, every element carefully planned and positioned. The cartel thought they were attacking a ranch. In reality, they were walking into one of the most sophisticated defensive positions ever constructed. El Cuchillo was getting frustrated. His men had taken positions around the house, but something felt wrong. The angles were odd, the cover not quite right. 30 years of survival instinct was screaming at him, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "I killed your husband!" he shouted, trying to provoke a response. "Guatemala, 1980. I watched him die." "No, Miguel," Margaret replied calmly. "You watched a CIA operative die. My husband passed peacefully in his sleep 10 years ago, but thank you for confirming what I've always suspected about Guatemala. I've spent 30 years wondering who gave the order." The revelation hit El Cuchillo like a physical blow. All these years, he'd thought that murder had been his greatest victory over La Viuda. Instead, It had been another of her deceptions. Team 3 reporting movement in the tunnels, Maria's voice crackled through the radio. They're sending men to check the basement, walking right into the kill zone. Margaret watched through her multiple camera feeds as cartel members approached the storm cellar. They thought they were being clever, looking for a way into the house. Instead, they were about to discover why she'd spent 2 years designing an underground labyrinth. Remember your assignments, she transmitted to her team. They think this is about taking the ranch. Let them keep thinking that until they're fully committed. She switched frequencies, activating systems that had lain dormant for years. Jack, is the QRF still on standby? Quick reaction force is 20 minutes out, he confirmed. Though, from what I'm seeing, we might not need them. Your preparations are impressive, even by your standards. Margaret's hands moved across her control panel, monitoring multiple systems simultaneously. The ranch's defenses were a symphony of old and new technology, decades of experience combined with cutting-edge innovation. Every fence post contained sensors, every cattle trough concealed weapons. Even the grazing patterns of her horses had been carefully planned to create clear fields of fire. Signal from the pressure plates, Carlos reported. They're moving their heavy weapons into position, right where you said they would. Through her scopes, Margaret watched El Cuchillo direct his men with growing frustration. He knew something was wrong. His survival instincts were screaming at him. But his pride and anger wouldn't let him back down, not when he was so close to revenge. La Viuda, he called out again. You can't hide forever. The cartel remembers. The cartel never forgives. Margaret checked her watch. The sun was rising higher, burning away the morning mist. Soon the cartel would be fully committed, their forces deployed exactly where she wanted them. 3 decades of planning were about to bear fruit. The cartel remembers, she whispered, to herself. But they never learn. She keyed her radio one final time. All teams, prepare for Phase 2. Just like we practiced. Across Shadow Creek Ranch, hidden systems hummed to life. In the killing fields of Colombia, Margaret Wilson had learned the art of patient revenge. Now, 30 years later, that patience was about to pay off. The first explosion came from beneath the earth. The cartel members checking the storm cellar had triggered exactly the wrong sensor, activating a system Margaret had installed 5 years ago. Non-lethal, but the concussive force sent them stumbling, back in panic and confusion. Right on schedule, Maria's voice came through the radio, satisfied. Underground team is falling back exactly as planned. They're about to trigger the secondary system. Margaret watched through her network of cameras as the cartel forces reacted exactly as she'd predicted. El Cuchillo was sending more men to investigate the explosion, spreading his forces thin, following the path she'd carefully laid out years in advance. You've lost your touch, Miguel, she called out, her voice carrying across the morning air. The old cartel would have recognized a channeling operation. But then, your father actually trained his men. You just recruit thugs. The taunt hit its mark. El Cuchillo's face contorted with rage. Bring up the heavy weapons, he screamed. Surround the house. No more games. Still so easy to manipulate, Jack commented through the secure channel. Though I have to admit, those reinforced tractor positions are some of your best work. They really think they're in cover. Margaret allowed herself a grim smile as she watched the cartel's mounted weapons move into position. Every piece of farm equipment that looked solid enough for cover had been carefully placed and modified. Some were reinforced to protect her team, others were designed to fail catastrophically when hit. Carlos, status on the ridge team? In position? The former sniper replied. Though I still can't believe you spent 3 years landscaping the entire ranch just to create these firing lanes. 5 years, Margaret corrected. Had to make it look natural. Even the grass height is calculated. Remember Colombia? How could I forget? The grass that was too even, too perfect, gave away the landing zone. Carlos chuckled. But this is art, Jefa. Through her thermal scopes, Margaret watched El Cuchillo's men continue their deployment. They were surrounding the house in a standard tactical formation, taking positions behind what they thought was random farm equipment and natural features. Instead, they were walking into firing lanes that had been planned and prepared for over a decade. Package confirms movement through tunnel system, Maria reported. They're following the marked path perfectly. Another 5 minutes and they'll reach the junction. The junction was Margaret's masterpiece, a reinforced underground command center disguised as an old root cellar. From there, her team could control every defensive system on the ranch. But El Cuchillo's men would never reach it. The tunnels leading there were designed to look structurally unsound, forcing them to take other routes. "Remember Medellin," she transmitted to her team. "Let them think they're being clever. Let them think they're finding the weak spots." A burst of gunfire shattered the morning calm. Some of El Cuchillo's more nervous men had started shooting at shadows, their bullets sparking harmlessly off reinforced walls designed to look like weathered wood. "Return fire," El Cuchillo ordered. "Burn this witch out!" The cartel's mounted weapons opened up, 50 caliber rounds tearing into the ranch house. To anyone watching, it would have looked like overwhelming force. But Margaret had spent years studying bullet impacts and structural engineering. Every round was being deflected or absorbed exactly as planned. "They've reached the second junction," Maria updated. "Splitting their forces just like you predicted. Main group heading for what they think is the basement access." Margaret checked her monitors. The cartel forces were now divided between 3 main groups: those attacking the house directly, those searching the tunnels, and those providing heavy weapons support. Exactly the deployment she'd spent years planning for. Time to introduce them to the real Shadow Creek Ranch, she decided, keying in a sequence she'd rehearsed countless times. "All teams, Protocol Echo is now active." Across the property, hidden systems began to wake up. Sensors that had lain dormant for years started tracking every movement. The real trap, 15 years in the making, was finally ready to spring. "La Viuda!" El Cuchillo shouted, his voice carrying an edge of desperation now. "You think your tricks? I can save you. I have 30 men. Heavy weapons. You're just an old woman." Margaret's reply was to activate another system. Across the ranch, hidden speakers began playing a different song. Not the Colombian folk tune from earlier, but something that made El Cuchillo's blood run cold. It was the same music that had been playing when she'd killed his father. 30 men, she transmitted to her team. "Just like Bogota. Some things never change." She checked her watch. "Phase 3 begins in 2 minutes. Remember your assignments, just like we practiced." As the sun climbed higher over Shadow Creek Ranch, Margaret Wilson prepared to demonstrate why La Viuda's reputation had survived 3 decades. The cartel was about to learn that they hadn't surrounded an old woman's ranch. They'd walked into a killing ground designed by one of the CIA's most legendary operators, and she'd had 15 years to make it perfect. The real power of Shadow Creek Ranch revealed itself in layers, like a master chess player's strategy finally unfolding. As Protocol Echo activated, Margaret's years of preparation transformed the peaceful Montana morning into something else entirely. The first sign was subtle, a low-frequency hum that made the cartel's radio communications crackle with interference. "Electromagnetic defense grid active," Jack confirmed. "Their comms are degrading exactly as planned. They're switching to backup frequencies now." "Let them," Margaret replied, watching through her thermal feeds. "Those are the channels you want them on." She'd spent years studying cartel communication protocols, knowing which backup systems they'd rely on when primary channels failed. The next layer of defense emerged from the earth itself. What had looked like ordinary cattle troughs began venting colored smoke, carefully designed to match the morning mist, but laden with compounds that played havoc with night vision equipment. "They're switching to thermal imaging," Carlos reported, from his sniper position. "Just like you said they would," walking right into the infrared masking field. Through her command screens, Margaret watched El Cuchillo's forces struggle to adapt. Their sophisticated equipment, which had made them feel invincible, was now working against them. The thermal signatures from her reinforced equipment created false targets, while her team's specialized gear rendered them nearly invisible. "Tunnel team reaching the first choke point," Maria updated. "They think they've found a structural weakness. Should I activate the hydraulic system?" "Not yet," Margaret decided, remembering similar patients in Colombia. "Let them commit fully to the position. Remember how your father always said, let them think they're being clever." Maria's laugh was soft but appreciative. Her father had been Margaret's first contact in Colombia, the man who'd helped her understand how to think 3 moves ahead. Now his daughter was helping spring a trap 3 decades in the making. El Cuchillo was beginning to realize something was wrong. His men's confident advance had turned hesitant. Equipment that had never failed them before was becoming unreliable. Even the ground beneath their feet felt somehow wrong. "You've lost your edge, Miguel," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the smoke-filled battlefield. Your father would be embarrassed. He at least checked for subsurface sensors before deploying heavy weapons. The taunt had its intended effect. El Cuchillo ordered his mounted 50 cals to open up, their heavy rounds chewing into the ranch house's facade. But Margaret had spent years studying ballistics and structural engineering. Each impact was absorbed or deflected exactly as designed. Primary firing lanes are clear, Carlos reported. They've positioned their heavy weapons exactly where we predicted. Permission to initiate response pattern Delta? Margaret checked her tactical display. El Cuchillo's forces were now divided into 3 main groups: the heavy weapons team, the house assault force, and the tunnel infiltration unit. Just as she'd planned. Commence Delta, she ordered. But remember, we're not just sending a message, we're teaching a lesson. Across Shadow Creek Ranch, hidden systems activated in precise sequence. The fence posts that had seemed so ordinary began emitting a high-frequency pulse that played havoc with the cartel's digital equipment. Targeting systems failed. Communication, devices squealed with interference. Underground team is getting desperate, Maria reported. They've reached the false command center. Should I spring the trap? Margaret smiled, remembering a similar operation in Bogota. Give them 1 more minute. Let them think they've found our nerve center. Then show them why we spent 2 years designing that particular surprise. The false command center had been one of her proudest achievements. A perfectly detailed replica, filled with convincing but ultimately useless equipment. The real control center was elsewhere, its location known only to her closest team members. La Viuda! El Cuchillo's voice carried a new edge of desperation. You think your tricks can save you? I have your position. I have your numbers. This ends today. Oh, Miguel, Margaret replied, her voice carrying decades of experience. You don't have anything. You never did. Ask yourself, why would a retired CIA operative choose this particular ranch? This exact location, these specific fields? Through her cameras, she watched realization finally dawn on his face. The ranch wasn't just a hiding place. Every acre, every building, every piece of equipment had been chosen and positioned for this moment. Now, she commanded into her radio, initiate full response protocol. Show them why Shadow Creek Ranch hasn't had a successful cattle rustling in 15 years. The morning air filled with the sound of multiple systems activating simultaneously. Hidden panels in the barn walls slid open, revealing modern weapon ports. The innocent-looking windmill transformed into a sophisticated electronic warfare platform. Even the cattle in the fields began moving in coordinated patterns, revealing that the seemingly random grazing paths were actually carefully designed firing lanes. My God, Jack whispered over the comm. When you said you'd been preparing, this is beyond anything we did in Colombia. Colombia was improvised, Margaret replied, her fingers dancing across her control panel. This was planned. 15 years of preparation, all for this moment. She keyed her external speakers. Time to remind the cartel why they used to fear La Viuda. Shadow Creek Ranch, which had appeared to be nothing more than an old woman's retirement, home, revealed its true nature. And in the command center, Margaret Wilson prepared to demonstrate that 30 years hadn't dulled her edge. They'd only given her time to perfect her methods. The false command center exploded in a precisely calculated cascade of destruction. Margaret watched through her monitors as El Cuchillo's tunnel team scrambled backward in panic, only to find their retreat routes mysteriously sealed. The underground, maze she'd spent years perfecting, was now a trap of epic proportions. Hydraulic barriers engaged, Maria reported, with professional satisfaction. They're completely sealed in Section C, just like the Medellin operation, but this time we control all the exits. Above ground, the situation was deteriorating rapidly for the cartel forces. Their sophisticated weapons, which had given them such confidence, were now worse than useless. The electromagnetic interference from Margaret's hidden systems had turned their tactical gear into expensive paperweights. They're switching to basic weapons, Carlos updated from his sniper position. No more thermal imaging, no more digital scopes. El Cuchillo's ordering them to go old school. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. They don't realize that's exactly what you wanted. Margaret allowed herself a grim smile. The cartel's modern equipment had made them lazy, dependent on technology. But she'd learned her craft in an era of iron sights and raw instinct. Every firing lane on the ranch had been calculated for traditional weaponry. Your father taught you to rely too much on gadgets, Miguel, she called out through The external speakers. He at least knew how to fight when the toys stopped working. The taunt struck home. Through her cameras, she watched El Cuchillo's face contort with rage. "Burn it all!" he screamed to his men. "Burn everything! No more games!" "He's deploying. They're incendiary weapons," Jack reported calmly. "Moving into the exact positions we predicted." Margaret nodded, though none of her team could see her. Time to show them why we spent 3 years installing the underground sprinkler system. She keyed in a complex sequence on her control panel. Initiate rainfall protocol. Across Shadow Creek Ranch, hidden nozzles emerged from seemingly solid ground. But instead of water, they sprayed a special compound developed by her CIA contacts. One that rendered incendiary weapons worse than useless. "First time deploying this system," Jack commented. "Sure it'll work like the lab boys promised?" His answer came immediately. The cartel's attempt to start fires resulted in spectacular, but harmless displays of color and smoke. Their incendiary grenades fizzled uselessly, creating more confusion than damage. "I tested it myself," Margaret replied. "Every month for 5 years. Even had them reformulate it twice to account for Montana's specific humidity conditions." Whammies. The tunnel system, Maria's team, was methodically herding the trapped cartel members toward predetermined containment areas. The underground maze, which had taken 3 years to construct, was proving its worth. "They're finding the messages," Maria reported with satisfaction. "The ones carved into the tunnel walls." This had been one of Margaret's more psychological touches. Throughout the tunnel system, she'd had phrases carved in Spanish. Old cartel warnings about La Viuda, dates of operations where she decimated their forces, names of fallen cartel leaders. Each one carefully chosen to erode the confidence of any invading force. Psychological warfare, she transmitted to her team. Just like Colombia, fear is a weapon too. Above ground, El Cuchillo was facing a rapidly deteriorating situation. His men were caught between hidden firing positions, their movements constrained by terrain features that only looked natural. Every piece of cover they sought had been carefully positioned to work against them. "You're in my house now, Miguel," Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the battlefield. Every inch of this ranch was designed for this moment. Every rock, every tree, every shadow. She paused for effect. "Just like I designed the trap that killed your father." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. "My father died in a firefight," he screamed. "A random encounter!" "Your father died exactly where I wanted him to," Margaret countered. "In the exact spot, at the exact time, in the exact way I planned. Just like you're standing exactly where I want you now." Through her thermal imaging, she watched the blood drain from his face as understanding finally dawned. The random firefight that had killed his father had been anything but random. Every aspect had been orchestrated by La Viuda, down to the Colombian folk song playing in the background. "Tunnel team reports final containment achieved," Maria updated. 23 hostiles secured in holding areas. "They're not going anywhere." "Surface team confirms optimal positioning," Carlos added. "Primary and secondary targets aligned exactly as planned." "Awaiting your order, Heifer." Margaret studied her tactical displays. El Cuchillo's forces had been systematically maneuvered into precisely the positions she'd spent years preparing for. Every escape route was covered, every piece of apparent cover compromised. "Remember what you told me in Bogotá, Miguel?" she asked, her voice carrying across the morning air. "About how the cartel never forgets, never forgives." She keyed in another sequence on her control panel. "Well, neither does La Viuda." Shadow Creek Ranch's final defensive systems began to activate. The trap 15 years in the making was about to spring its last and deadliest surprises. And in her command center, Margaret Wilson prepared to demonstrate why some legends only grow stronger with age. The truth about El Cuchillo's father's death emerged in layers, like the ranch's defenses. As Margaret activated her final protocols, her voice carried across the battlefield, each word precisely chosen to cut deeper than any bullet. "Your father didn't die in a random firefight, Miguel. He died exactly 30 years ago today, in a room carefully prepared, with exits precisely measured and timing perfectly calculated." Through her scopes, she watched him freeze. Even the folk song was chosen specifically. "Your grandmother's favorite, wasn't it?" "You're lying!" he screamed, but the doubt was already creeping into his voice. "The reports, the witnesses, all part of the plan," Margaret replied calmly, watching his men's positions on her tactical display. "Every witness, every report, every piece of evidence. I spent 6 months preparing them. Your father's death wasn't an accident. It was an execution, designed to look like a cartel power struggle. The revelation had its intended effect. El Cuchillo's carefully coordinated assault began to fragment as his concentration wavered, exactly as Margaret had planned. Multiple targets breaking formation, Carlos reported from his hidden position. Their discipline is cracking, just like you predicted. Tunnel team reports similar disarray, Maria added. The captured men are talking. Seems Miguel hasn't been entirely honest with them about why they're here. Margaret watched through her network of cameras as the truth continued to spread through the cartel forces. They'd come expecting an easy operation against an old woman. Instead, they'd walked into an elaborate trap set by a legend they'd been taught to fear since childhood. You want to know why I chose your father, Miguel? She continued, each word calculated to further destabilize him. Because he was becoming exactly what you are now, sloppy, arrogant, depending on fear rather than skill. She paused for effect. But mostly because he made the same mistake you're making. He underestimated old women. Jeffa, Jack's voice came through her private channel. QRF reports multiple cartel reinforcements approaching from the south, at least 4 vehicles, heavily armed. Right on schedule, Margaret replied. They're following the exact route we prepared. Activate the Valley protocols. The southern approach to Shadow Creek Ranch had been one of her masterpieces of deception. What looked like an ordinary mountain valley was actually a carefully engineered killing ground. Every boulder, every tree, every seemingly random feature had been positioned to create perfect fields of fire. Your father had reinforcements too, Miguel, she called out. They died in a valley much like the one your men are driving through right now. Would you like to know what his last words were? El Cuchillo snapped. Kill her, he screamed to his remaining men. Kill them all! But the cartel forces were now caught in Margaret's final trap. As they moved to attack, hidden systems activated throughout the ranch. 15 years of preparation revealed its ultimate purpose. All teams, execute final protocol, Margaret commanded. Show them why we spent so much time practicing this exact scenario. The ranch transformed. What had looked like random farm equipment became interlocking fields of fire. Hidden bunkers that even the cartel's thermal imaging hadn't detected, open to reveal her waiting team members. Every escape route turned into a carefully designed containment zone. Your father died confused, Miguel, Margaret continued, watching him realize the full extent of his predicament. Just like you're confused now, wondering how an old woman could have planned all this, wondering why every move you make seems to be anticipated. Through her monitors, she watched the approaching reinforcements enter the valley. They had no idea that every inch of their route had been prepared years in advance. The apparent safety of the valley walls would soon become their prison. Valley team in position, Carlos reported. Just like we practiced. They're following the guide markers perfectly. Those markers had taken 3 years to position. Subtle signs that only cartel drivers would recognize and trust. Each one leading them deeper into a trap decades in the making. You know what your father's real mistake was? Margaret asked, her finger hovering over the final activation sequence. He thought La Viuda was just a codename. He never understood that it was a promise. The morning sun had fully risen now, burning away the last of the mist. Shadow Creek Ranch stood revealed in the clear Montana light, every inch of its 15 years of preparation about to serve its true purpose. Initiate Omega Protocol, Margaret commanded. Let's show the cartel why some legends never die. As her team moved with practiced precision, Margaret Wilson prepared to finish what she'd started 30 years ago in the killing fields of Colombia. El Cuchillo was about to learn that underestimating La Viuda was a mistake you only made once, just like his father had. Omega Protocol transformed Shadow Creek Ranch into the killing ground it was always meant to be. The valley erupted in precisely calculated explosions, trapping the reinforcements between sheer rock walls. In the ranch proper, Margaret's hidden defenses emerged for their final purpose. Valley team contained, Carlos reported. No survivors trying to retreat. Looks like your geological surveys paid off. Rock slides exactly as predicted. El Cuchillo watched his reinforcements' destruction through his tactical scope, his last hope dying in the morning sun. Around him, his remaining men were caught in crossfires they hadn't believed possible from a ranch house. You never understood the name. Margaret's voice carried across the battlefield. La Viuda, the widow. Your father thought it was about my husband, but it was about what I became after he died. Something patient. Something that never stops. Hunting. Her team moved with lethal precision, decades of experience combining with years of specific preparation for this moment. Each shooter knew their exact role, every angle covered, every contingency planned for. Your father died begging, Miguel, Margaret continued, watching him through her scopes. Begging not for his life, but for me to tell him why. Why him? Why that day? Why that song? She paused. Would you like to know what I told him? El Cuchillo's response was to draw his signature knife, the one that had given him his name. Come out and tell me yourself, old woman, he screamed, desperation making him reckless. Margaret's laugh was cold. The same words your father heard. Some debts can only be paid in blood. She keyed her radio. All teams, execute final containment. Bring me El Cuchillo, alive. The morning air filled with the sound of Margaret's justice, 30 years in the making. Shadow Creek Ranch claimed its final victims, proving that some legends never retire, they just get more patient. El Cuchillo's capture was methodical, like everything else at Shadow Creek Ranch. Margaret's team had practiced this moment for years, each member knowing their exact role in containing the cartel leader. As they brought him into the ranch house's main room, he found himself face to face with a legend he'd underestimated. Welcome to my real command center, Miguel, Margaret said, standing from her monitoring station. At 75, she moved with the careful precision of age, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Not the decoy your men found underground. This is where I've watched you for the past 15 years, waiting for today. The room's walls were covered with surveillance photos, intelligence reports, and cartel documents, a timeline of El Cuchillo's entire criminal career. But it was the oldest photo that caught his attention. His father, 30 years ago, in a room in Colombia. That picture was taken exactly 3 minutes before your father died, Margaret explained, following his gaze. Notice the detail in the background, the painting on the wall, your grandmother's favorite artist. The folk song playing wasn't an accident either. Everything was chosen to send a message. What message? El Cuchillo spat, though fear had begun replacing anger in his eyes. Why all this? Why wait 30 years? Margaret moved to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder. Because revenge is like good whiskey, Miguel. It gets better with age. She opened the file, revealing documents that made his face go pale. But mostly because I needed to wait for you to become exactly like your father, making the same mistakes, trusting the same people. Teams report total containment, Jack's voice came through the radio. All hostiles either captured or neutralized. Valley team confirms no survivors from the reinforcement group. Margaret nodded, satisfied. Your father died thinking he was the victim of a random cartel war, Miguel. I wanted you to know better, to understand that everything, from Colombia to today, was planned, orchestrated, inevitable. She gestured to Maria, who brought forward another file. You see, your father didn't just kill my husband. He killed 3 other CIA operatives. That year. Good people. People with families. Her voice hardened. People who trusted his word about safe passage through cartel territory. Understanding dawned in El Cuchillo's eyes. The peace talks, the negotiations, were a trap, Margaret finished. Your father used them to identify and eliminate CIA assets. Very clever, very thorough. She smiled coldly. Just like I've been very clever and very thorough in planning this day. Through the windows, morning sun illuminated Shadow Creek Ranch, revealing the full scope of Margaret's preparation. Every building, every fence, every seemingly random feature had been positioned for this moment. Your father's last words weren't begging, by the way, she added, almost casually. He laughed, said no one could plan revenge this perfect. She looked at El Cuchillo with eyes that had seen decades of shadow wars. He was wrong, and now you know just how wrong he was. Outside, her team continued securing the ranch, but Margaret knew the real operation, the one 30 years in the making, was already complete. La Viuda had kept her promise, proving that some debts can only be paid in blood and some legends never truly retire. By sunset, Shadow Creek Ranch had transformed again. FBI evidence teams combed through the property, documenting a defensive setup that would be studied in intelligence academies for years to come. Margaret sat in her kitchen with her old team, drinking coffee that Maria had prepared using their special Colombian blend. CIA's having fits, Jack reported, checking his secure phone. 15 years of unauthorized surveillance, a private military operation on US soil, and enough classified technology to start a small war. They don't know whether to arrest you or hire you back. Margaret smiled, the expression making her look more like the retired rancher she'd pretended to be. They won't do either. Check the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one marked Insurance. Carlos, who had retrieved the file, let out a low whistle as he read. Authorization codes. Signed operations permits. Official sanction for a deep cover mission to... He looked up, understanding dawning. You never retired at all, did you? Officially, Shadow Creek Ranch is a CIA black site, Margaret confirmed. Has been since I bought it. Every modification, every piece of equipment, every operation, all officially sanctioned under Operation Long Shadow. She sipped her coffee. The agency needed a way to monitor cartel operations in the northern states. I needed a way to settle old debts. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Through the kitchen window, they could see El Cuchillo being loaded into an unmarked federal transport. The cartel leader looked small now, stripped of his power, and finally understanding the true scope of what had happened. The real operation wasn't just about revenge, Margaret continued, opening another file. El Cuchillo's organization had been moving into human trafficking, targeting remote ranches as distribution points. The agency needed them stopped, but couldn't risk official involvement. My personal motivation just made me the perfect operator. Maria, who had been monitoring communications, looked up from her laptop. Cartel channels are exploding. Words spreading about what happened here. La Viuda isn't just a legend anymore. She's become something else. A warning. Good, Margaret nodded. That was always part of the plan. The cartels understand symbols, respect legends. After today, every trafficking operation will think twice about moving into ranch country. Jack studied the property blueprints spread across the table. All these years, every time we trained here, ran drills, prepared for this day. You were actually running an official operation. The revenge was just a bonus. The best covers are the ones based on truth, Margaret replied, echoing one of her old CIA teaching points. The agency got their monitoring station and countermeasures against cartel expansion. I got to keep a promise made 30 years ago in Colombia. And El Cuchillo's organization is finished, their operations exposed, their networks compromised. Outside, federal teams continued processing the battlefield. Every piece of evidence would support the official story. A successful operation against cartel expansion. Only those in Margaret's kitchen would know the full truth. How personal vengeance and official sanction had combined into something unprecedented. What happens now? Carlos asked, cleaning his rifle one last time. To the ranch. To us? Margaret stood, moving to a hidden wall panel. Behind it was a safe that even her team hadn't known about. Now, she said, retrieving a final file. We implement the last phase of Operation Long Shadow. Because El Cuchillo wasn't the only one who inherited his father's debts. The file Margaret withdrew from her hidden safe was older than El Cuchillo's operation. Older than Shadow Creek Ranch itself. Its pages were yellowed, but the CIA classifications were still clear. Operation Monarch, 1975. El Cuchillo's father wasn't working alone, she explained, spreading photographs across her kitchen table. The cartel's expansion, the betrayals, the murdered agents. It was all part of something bigger, something that's been waiting in the shadows for decades. Her team leaned forward, studying images that connected multiple cartel operations across 3 generations. But it was the newest photograph that drew their attention. A compound in northern Mexico, heavily fortified, supposedly abandoned. The next generation, Margaret continued. Children of cartel leaders we thought we'd eliminated. They've been rebuilding the old networks, using their father's connections. El Cuchillo was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Shadow Creek Ranch wasn't your endgame, Jack realized, understanding dawning. It was your proving ground, showing what a properly prepared defensive position could do against modern cartel tactics. Margaret smiled, the expression making her look like the legendary operative she'd never stopped being. 6 other ranches, she said quietly, all strategically positioned along cartel trafficking routes, all owned by retired CIA assets, all prepared exactly like this one. Maria's laptop displayed satellite imagery of seemingly innocent properties across the American Southwest. Each one, they now realized, was a trap waiting to be sprung. The agency didn't just sanction my operation, Margaret explained. They used it as a template. Shadow Creek Ranch proved that small, well-prepared teams could destroy much larger cartel forces. Now that template gets implemented on a larger scale. Through the window, they watched federal teams continuing their evidence collection. Every piece would be studied, every system analyzed, every tactic documented. Shadow Creek Ranch would become the model for a new kind of defense against cartel expansion. La Viuda's legend grows stronger, Carlos noted, understanding the broader strategy. Every cartel leader will think twice before moving against any remote ranch. They'll never know which ones are ready for them. Margaret moved to her radio setup, entering a sequence that activated receivers across the country. Other retired operators, other prepared positions, all waiting for the signal that would launch the next phase of Operation Long Shadow. El Cuchillos. Capture isn't the end, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of planning. It's an announcement, a message to the next generation of cartel leaders, a reminder that some legends don't just survive, they evolve. Her team watched as she sent the activation codes. Across the southwest, other hidden operations would now begin. Other traps would be set. Other legends would be born. My husband died thinking he was part of a failed peace negotiation, Margaret said quietly. He never knew he was the first casualty in a shadow war that would span generations. Today, we honor his memory, not just with revenge, but with a legacy that will protect others. As night fell over Shadow Creek Ranch, Margaret Wilson, La Viuda, stood with her team one last time. They had helped her keep a promise made in the killing fields of Colombia. Now they would help her keep an even older promise, to ensure that the shadows belong to those who protected, not those who prayed. The cartels think they understand patience, she said, watching the stars emerge. Over her battleground disguised as a ranch, they think waiting 30 years for revenge is impressive. She smiled, the expression carrying decades of secret victories. Let's show them what real patience looks like. In the distance, coyotes howled, nature's approval of La Viuda's justice. Shadow Creek Ranch had served its purpose, becoming the stage for a legend's greatest operation. But for Margaret Wilson and her team, it was just the beginning. The next generation of cartel leaders would learn what their fathers had forgotten. Some debts carry interest across decades. Some legends grow stronger with time. And the most dangerous predator isn't the one that strikes quickly. It's the one that spends a lifetime preparing for a single perfect moment. La Viuda's war wasn't over. It was evolving, spreading, becoming something that would echo through generations. And somewhere in the darkness, other retired operators watched their ranches and waited, ready to remind the cartels why some legends should never be forgotten. The end.